Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olga Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukraine Media Center today. Today we have invited you to discuss a presentation of the study called Russia, China, Turkey, the EU, and Ukraine, who will win the Moldova's parliamentary elections. So during our event, we will present the joint study by research solution about the interests of the key players in the region and their impact on the elections in Moldova. So let me introduce the speakers today. Joining us in the studio are Iliya Kusa, author of the research, Alina Hrytsenko, who will be joining us online. She's the co-author of the research. Also joining us is Igar Tyshkevich, author of the research, and Vadym Denysenko, political scientist. Good morning, dear friends. And a couple of words of presentation. We remember that presidential elections and referendum have taken place in Moldova last year. According to the results, the effective president has taken the victory with more than 50% of the votes, but those were not the results everybody was counting on. And based on the results, the director of the intelligence of Moldova said that Russia was trying to influence the elections. He mentioned the Russian intrusion in referendum and the elections process, and he reminded the people's deputies that most likely the same would happen during the parliamentary elections. So today we will discuss not only the influence of Russia, but all of the key players in the region, and we'll talk about the strategic role of Moldova in the European security architecture. So, Mr. Iliya, the floor is yours. Please start your presentation. Thank you so much. So let's start with the beginning. The first part is devoted to overview of Moldova from the point of view of its political stance, and we've identified 5 key features we have to pay attention to before proceeding to the talks about international players. First, the territory of Moldova was always perceived as a transitor between different key regions, plus Black Sea Basin, which explains why the territory of Moldova was always experiencing certain interests from different big countries who were exercising their expansionist policies. Then Moldova is connected to the Black Sea, which means it was always interacting with the Ottoman Empire, and it made Moldova vulnerable to Ottoman influences, which was quite intense in Moldova, along with the influence of Russian Empire. Looking at Moldova's history within the period of the last 200 to 300 years, we will be able to see that its role was boiling down to the role of frontier between big empires, which resulted in having Moldova locked in between the centers of force that were using Moldova as an arena for their competition, which in its turn affected the national identity of Moldova. They were always torn in between the empires. There was a fight of big empires in their territory and frequent wars. And in its turn, it resulted in having the territory of historical Moldova divided between a number of different countries. And this is the situation until this very moment. So basically, the Moldova of today is not the same Moldova it was called back in the century 15 or 16. So the Soviet heritage in Moldova resulted to them having the same problems as we have in Ukraine. A rift in the society without reflection of its history, including Soviet history, a high level of paternalism as a result, and also Moldova has a huge diaspora living abroad. It has negative demographics, and after the most recent elections, such a story was cemented about two Moldovas, one is Moldova as a population of Moldova, and another Moldova diaspora living abroad. And just like we've seen during the most recent elections, they have different ideological and political views that was reflected in presidential elections voting. So talking about that, the value of Moldova for key foreign players was boiling down to those 5 key features, in our opinion. First, Moldova was perceived as a territory through which you can project force, so political control over Chisinau was allowing big countries to project their forces over the region, being in competition with other players. So it's just a political value without any connection to natural resources. Then it's a point of entry to the Central and Eastern Europe. It's clear a control over another country in this region creates a potential for further expansion of the region or sub-region. Moldova is perceived as an arena for ideological fight between West and non-West. In a larger sense, Moldova is a country with a small territory and small population, and there are no big amounts of natural resources in Moldova. Very frequently, it ended up in the middle of the fight, such an ideological, symbolic fight, just like the one going on now between the so-called Western countries who think that Moldova should become a part of NATO and EU, and thus to demonstrate the victory of the Western project, Western Atlantic project, and non-Western countries, each of whom sees something else in Moldova. For example, Russia sees Moldova as a post-Soviet Moldova who should stay in their sphere of influence without joining the Western project. Turkey, they have their perspective of nation and the territory. Igor will give us more details about that, specifically during the Erdogan times, who is quite nostalgic about those good old times. And other countries such as China, who see Moldova, unlike other historical players, they see Moldova and our region in more of an economic perspective rather than political, such as infrastructure projects that may convert into political influence. And the last thing, a gray zone. What we call a gray zone is a use of the Moldova's territory and the state of Moldova as a point of tension and as a zone of unpredictability when, through destabilizing the situation in Moldova, the competitors' projects can be blocked, or the expansion of the competitors can be prevented, or the situation can be destabilized to exercise pressure over the central government in Moldova or the competitors. For example, when we talk about Russia, they can exercise their pressure over the countries of EU and NATO. And generally, this is what Moldova is, why Moldova is interesting. Well, the historic role of Moldova has not changed dramatically. Now, in the territory of Moldova, in the territories of historic Moldova, it's bigger, it's larger than the actual Moldova, but its role, its historical role that it had for bigger countries from the geostrategy, geopolitical perspective, it's still there. And now let's proceed to the key regional players and their interests. And here we'd like to start with the United States. It was my part. And when I was preparing it, I can say there's a lot to be said. Maybe it's a paradox, maybe not much so, but the United States never considered Moldova as a priority region. It had a secondary role for them during many administrations. There was no single administration which would deploy some serious Eastern European policy with Moldova in the middle, in its center. And this is what's interesting, that Moldova is not the sphere of the vital interests of the United States, and during current administration we forecast that they would hardly work with Moldova in a different way, even given the current amount of activities in Moldova. It would be good if it will be still there, because the current administration demonstrated that they want to cut all of the expenses possible. And yet another thing, that there was ideological competition with Russian Federation. There was no fight for economic resources or influence. It was more about some symbolic ideological competition with Russia, who was trying to maintain control over Moldova, trying to demonstrate together with Europe to block Russian expansion and to compete with them in terms of ideology and the victory of the Western project. Outsourced micromanagement, by that we mean that the United States are not trying to manage Moldova or control Moldova, given the fact that it's a secondary country for them. I think they have a secondary role here. The primary role is played by European Union and Romania, and the United States agree with such a stance. They don't object it. Even during different periods, they were supporting this idea of having Moldova handled by its partners and closest neighbors. Before the conflict in Transnistria, the United States were approaching the conflict just like they approached the conflict in Ukraine, freezing as a best option, given there are no other alternatives, and then the localization of the conflict so it doesn't spill over the borders of Transnistria to prevent any further disruption, and control of the risks to prevent any situations in which United States wouldn't like to end up in. And Euro-Atlantic integration is the central topic of bargaining in negotiations with Russian Federation, and it's a key card the United States are playing against Russia to bargain with them politically, a fact that we were witnessing a lot of times, or to block any of their attempts to increase their control over Chisinau. I think that's it with the United States. I don't think that anything would change with the current Trump's administration. I think that there will be more focus on some spheres, such as reduction of costs. We've already witnessed the freezing of USAID programs. I think that given the priorities set by President Trump, there would be no sudden expansion of Moldovan policy in the United States. So I think that that's basically it. Thank you, Mr. Iliya, Ms. Alina. I'm hoping you're hearing and seeing us, and we're inviting you to join in. Well, my part of the study was about European Union in general, and we've picked Germany, France, and Poland as the key EU states. And what were my conclusions? Today, during the escalation of threats emanating from Kremlin, the role of Moldova is growing in the European Union. Moldova is a small and politically undeveloped country, but it ended up in the epicenter of the regional instability, because security of Moldova is intertwined with the security of all of the Eastern Europe, Transnistria conflict, demilitarization of the region, potential aggression of Russia against Moldova. All of those facts may have serious consequences not only for the state of Moldova, but the security architecture of Europe in general. And when it comes to some radical scenarios, such as occupation of the country by the Kremlin, European Union is facing another strategic challenge that will require complex political and military efforts to deter further expansion of Russian influence. And in this context, strengthening of Moldova's positions gains primary meaning for ensuring of stability and peace in the Europe. During the last decade, the EU was the source of financial support for Moldova. They offer quite a wide range of programs and tools for the country aimed at support of the country's development, its process of EU integration, and one of the key instruments through which such funding is provided is Global Europe, that is oriented at good neighbor relations, development, and cooperation. EU is a partner, is the biggest trade partner for Moldova, and what also needs to be mentioned that EU was in solidarity with Moldova, having imposed full liberalization of agricultural trade with Moldova and Ukraine, and it will continue until the middle of the year 2025. EU develops its cooperation with Moldova in security policy, and last year Moldova has become the first country who signed an agreement with EU in the area of security. During the intensification of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Moldova intensified its negotiations with NATO. They've announced the expansion of expenses for the defense sector, which amounted to $87 million. In June 2023, EU promised to allocate €40 million for procurement of non-lethal weapons for Moldova, and another program aimed at handing over of UAVs and other material to Moldova that will last 3 years. Also contemplated cooperation in the area of cybersecurity and military control. When it comes to specific countries, Moldova has close ties with those countries that I've mentioned: Germany, Poland, and France, the Weimar Triangle so-called. Berlin is quite consistent in having Moldova involved in the processes of European integration and Euro-Atlantic integration. Moldova works with the German government under the program of modernization of the armed forces. The members of the Parliamentary Commission of Bundestag on Foreign Policy and European Integration approved the process of negotiations between the governments of Moldova and Nemechina aimed at reinforcing the military potential of Moldova to ensure peace and stability in both national and regional level. Until this moment, Moldova remains one of the poorest countries in the region, but it's still of interest to Germany due to security reasons, first of all, because given the growth of tension in the eastern frontiers of Europe after annexation of Crimea by Russia and another phase of war of Russia against Ukraine, Germany is interested in supporting those countries who are experiencing Russian pressure, and the stability of Moldova is important for ensuring of security in the region in general. From the foreign policy perspective, Germany is interested in strengthening its positions in the countries which have a potential to become buffer zones between Europe and Russia. So for Germany, Moldova is an important country in the wide geopolitical perspective, and Germany is interested in democratic reforms in Moldova, even despite Moldova facing some economic difficulties, because the interest of Germany is to reinforce those buffer zones in the frontiers of European Union to deter Russian expansion in the region. Yet another important partner for Moldova is Poland. The Polish-Moldovan relations are intensifying, and just like in the case of Germany and European Union in general, the accent after the year 2022 shifted to military and political dialogue. Poland helps to modernize Moldovan armed forces and to reinforce the Moldovan defense sector. For example, in the year 2024, Moldova has signed an agreement with the Polish ammunition manufacturer of anti-tank rockets to modernize the defense sector of Moldova. And now the embassy of Poland in Moldova serves as a connecting link between Moldova and NATO. It works as a liaison office, explaining to the Moldovan society the advantages of joining NATO. When it comes to France, basically, in order not to repeat myself, they have the similar goals and tasks as Germany. Just like Germany, France is interested in stability in the eastern frontier of Europe. And obviously Moldova, which is close to Ukraine, which is Ukraine's neighbor, who is in the Russian sphere of influence, are a serious player in terms of deterring Russian expansion. And yet another important neighbor who was studied in context of Moldova was China. Their influence and interest is not so intense as their neighbors, but it's predefined by a number of economic factors as well as political ambitions of Beijing in the region. Moldova, which is located in the crossroads of Balkans and Eastern Europe, could become interest for China within its one road, one way plan. However, Moldova is actually locked between Ukraine and Romania, and in terms of logistics, they are of no interest to China. However, they continue developing their relations with Moldova in other areas, and one of the intentions of China is to expand the trade ties. However, Moldova has a small economy, but it's still of interest to China, who continues developing agriculture, energy projects, infrastructure projects in the country. So all of those sectors are interesting for Chinese investments and cooperation. China is more interesting to Moldova than Moldova to China, because such cooperation opens new opportunities for diversifying the foreign ties, raising foreign investments, Chinese technologies, loans, equipment for modernization of different economy sectors. It all helps to support Moldova in the conditions of limited resources, plus the expansion of trade with China gives Moldova more chances to improve its export positions, specifically in the agricultural sector, where Chinese market plays an important role, because Moldova exports wine to China quite intensely, which is appreciated by Chinese consumers due to its low price and high quality. China uses economic projects as a tool of political influence in Eastern Europe under conditions of political instability in the region. And Beijing sees cooperation with Chisinau as an opportunity to strengthen its ties with Europe. And without being a member of EU or NATO, Moldova can get more advantages from its cooperation with China in exchange for limited political loyalty in international platforms. So those are the conclusions for the time being. Thank you, Ms. Alina. Mr. Igar, the floor is yours. Good morning. Presentation, if I may. So my part was starting with Romania. Well, the foundation for cooperation is quite interesting. I mean, if we look from historic perspective, that's a historic trauma of a divided people. For the people of Romania, it makes no difference whether you're Romanian or Moldovan. But in Moldova, after it was captured by the Soviet Union, those territories of Bessarabia, Soviet Union was betting on creation of so-called Moldovan identity. Like they have similar languages, the same history, but they're a different people. And this trauma of a divided people identifies the framework within which Moldova is operating, because it's considered that Bessarabia, in a wider sense, is a territory of historic Romania, and Romania cannot abstain from cooperation with Romania. Romania cannot turn their back on their people, but any pro-Russian or any pro-Russian sentiment is quite painful for Moldovan society and for Romanian government and society. So from the point of view of historic background, they work on the unionist sentiment. However, the sociology in Romania is quite interesting. If you ask, there is a number of sociological data sets. So if you ask, should Bessarabia eventually join Romania, more than 75% say so. But when it comes to Moldova as a state, the answer yes would only be a little bit more than 50%. So this unionist sentiment ties Moldova to Romania. Again, Russian influence, disruption, and quite a big number of risks. So it's a matter of Soviet heritage, not only in the context of Soviet Moldovans, but it's about Gagauz and other national minorities and their political orientation. And another interesting thing is dependent society on both parts of the border. So there is no statistics about how many Moldovan citizens have Romanian passports. There is a law on repatriation. You have to apply to the government of Romania that you have a grandfather or grandmother who was living in Romania before the year 1939. The application may be considered and the citizenship may be provided, but the amount of the applications submitted and the amount of extended citizenships, there is a huge gap between them, which creates a lot of accusations on part of Moldovan deputies, because back in the year 2019, one of the deputies was accusing the Romanian government that there was more than a million applications, but the citizenship was provided to about 750, 800,000 citizens. But okay, if it's 800,000 and the total population of Moldova is 2.7 million, it's a huge number still. It means that there is a number of voters in Moldova who may vote in favor of a course related or connected with Romania. But may such a person with a Romanian passport vote in the Romanian elections? And if those citizens may be influenced by Russian narratives, those people will vote in certain authorities, certain deputies who may exercise certain policies in the territory of Romania. So this mutual dependency is a support of what we call passportization in Ukraine, but on the flip side, it's the expression of care, whether it's safe for us. From the point of view of Romania's advent, they were a little bit late when it comes to Romania's expansionist policy. It started about 10 to 15 years ago. Before that, there was an economic crisis in Romania. Before that, they were taking care of their Euro-Atlantic course, so cultural policy was always there. But when it comes to consistent economic and policy, it's very demonstrative. The structure of experts of Moldova in the year 2010 and 2022. So look at the structure of the export. Romania, as a neighboring country, was taken as significant place, but at the same time, there was a lot of trade with Italy, and there was Russia in the first place. Again, that's not about imports, not the energy resources. It's the exports, the proceeds of the government budget. And basically, it was something that caused correction of the political course of the Moldovan government, and on top of that, the impact on economy. Well, it was about the political parties. The first political parties emerged in the years 1992-1993, and Russia was playing that card successfully. They were trying to retain Moldova in their sphere of influence, creating some equality between unionism and Euro integration issues, because from the objective perspective, Euro integration is not the same as joining Romania. But Russian propaganda was equalizing it. Like, okay, if it's Euro integration, it creates a threat for those who arrived at Moldova after the year 1940, because everything will become Romania, and thus they were having their advantage. But again, when it comes to all those influences, like the game of orthodoxy, it's something that is very painful for Russia. 20 years ago, the Romanian Orthodox Church has reestablished their orthodoxy. It was a regional church in Moldova with a small number of parishes, but starting with the year 1940, if I'm not mistaken, the Orthodox metropolis of Moldova was divided into a number of patriarchates, which resulted in religious conflict between Moldova, Romania, and Russian Federation. They said they were going to go to the Court for Human Rights for violation of the rights of Moldovans. So it was all the Russian Orthodox Church who were claiming it. And back then, the President Voronin, the pro-Russian communist president, engaged political levers to intensify this process. They were sending out Romanian priests out of Moldova, and he was awarded with an award of Patriarch Cyril for protection of the Orthodox world. So it's all connected with the matters of Russian Orthodox Church as a section of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Because if you visit the website of the Russian Orthodox Church, they talk about a number of cultural installations that amount to 37,000 all around the world and 15,000 in Russia only. In the territory of Romania, Romanian Orthodox Church has 16,100 parishes, and if Russia starts losing its foreign installations and parishes, it results in revolution in the Orthodox world, because otherwise, if Russian Orthodox Church collapses, Romanian Orthodox Church becomes the biggest one in the world. Even with all due respect to Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Romanian one becomes the biggest, and it creates a great threat for Russia. And the topic of orthodoxy, this card is played intensely in Transnistria, in Gagauzia, even despite the fact that Transnistria doesn't have such a religious population, but it's still the fact. For Romania, the Romanian party doesn't intensify this topic, but it goes in parallel with passportization. Advocacy of Moldova in the foreign arena. Alina was saying that a lot of foreign players work through Romania. Romania is taken these days. It's a matter of Euro integration and cooperation with NATO, cooperation with other centers of force, and this is what predefines the specifics of economic cooperation. And during the year 2010, and it was repeated in the years 2018 and 2020, when the sociologists were asking about the speed of Euro integration. I mean, if sociologists are asking about that, it means that there is such a sentiment in the Romanian society. In case of failure of Moldovan Euro integration, is there a chance to have the countries united? And the majority of the society were saying, like, okay, if it cannot be solved through Brussels, we can unite, and Moldova will eventually end up in Europe one way or another. And people were consciously answering yes, understanding that it would create a conflict with Brussels. But from the current perspective, it's important for Romania to preserve current independence of Moldova, even in the process of Euro integration. First, it's a buffer, and on top of that, if Euro integration is successful, it creates additional vote in any council that may make solutions in the regional format. And if Moldova becomes a part of the European Union, it's a Black Sea format or other multilateral format, because they are yet another independent state. So Euro integration through union is the worst case scenario for Moldova, but this is the sentiment that exists in Romanian society. Now let's proceed to Turkey. What can be said about Turkish policy? Turkey is another country who is catching up with Russia in the region, even despite a long history of cooperation of this region with Moldova in particular. Until the year 11 or 12, Moldova was beyond the attention of Turkish foreign policy. There were cultural ties, the network of Turkish organizations was being established. There were certain sentiment to Gagauz, who is a Turkic people confessing Christian Orthodoxy. But before that, Turkey didn't have financial, human, and other resources for cultural and economic expansion in the region of Moldova. But with the advent of Erdogan, the situation started shifting, and when Turkey started as a regional leader, say after the year 2016, Turkish policy in the Moldovan axis was intensified, and their target region is Gagauzia. When it comes to the cooperation between Moldova and Turkey, it seems quite intense, but if you look at the map of Moldova, it's all focused in Gagauzia and not beyond that region, because even opening key cultural or sport installations, those are the events attended, say, by the President of Turkey and other Turkish officials. They use Chisinau just as a transitory airport without even meeting their Moldovan peers. Well, when it comes to the investments in human resources, it's quite interesting, because if we look at the investments of key investors in the region, first place is Russia, then goes Romania, and Turkey is not there. But when you read Turkish speakers, they say Turkey has invested more than $300 million in Moldova lately, which resulted in creation of more than 6,000 jobs. But if you look at the methodology of calculation by the Central Bank of Moldova and what can be understood as investments by the Turks, everything takes their places. Within the last 5 years, Turkey has built education center. They are finalizing the construction of a stadium now, And now they discuss the construction of international airport in Kobra. The decision is not yet made, but it's about the investments in the infrastructure and loan facilities for Gagauzian businesses. Well, for example, if you build a big education center, from Turkish perspective, it's a big investment because people work there. If you pay for its function, people work there. But from the point of view of Moldova, it's not investment in their economy. But this policy is there, and it's a policy aimed at strengthening their position in the region. When it comes to political context, here's quite a simple example. Traditionally, the women are taking the office of the government of Gagauzia. The last visit of Turkish officials was in the year 2023, and before that there was one in the year 2021, a official meeting with the president of Turkey, Erdogan. And you can check whether within that same period, there were meetings with the president of Moldova. So the head of Gagauzia is going to Turkey on the very next week after the elections in Moldova. Then she goes to Moscow, making a number of quite drastic statements, negatively perceived in both Moldova and Ukraine. But then she suddenly goes to Turkey, trying to somehow rectify those statements. So now the Turkish, they support the political subjectivity of Gagauzia itself, and it's interesting for the Turkish that they try to supplant the Russian influence, but just like it works in Ajaria, Georgia, and Abkhazia, who is under effective Russian control, they don't dare for the direct conflict until it gains some critical mass. So they don't touch upon the topic of Christianity. Say in Gagauzia, having the Constantinople Patriarch under their influence, they could, though Turkey is quite conscious with the political remembrance of the World War II, but they saturate the field of political memory with Gagauzian identity, with their narratives. And also from the investment perspective, they create the economic foundation to ensure the existence of such an autonomy. Yet another interesting example, Moldova has invited Turkey to build solar and wind power plants. It happened just a couple of weeks ago. Now they're in the process of negotiations of details, so I think there will be no surprise about the region where such capacities will be built. So when it comes to Turkish influence in the region, then influence the political course through Gagauzia, the region of Gagauzia. Also they influence the southern regions of Ukraine, and the influence of Turkey in Gagauzia will intensely trigger the Gagauzian population in Ukraine in the number of small villages. Well, creation of additional points of influence in the Black Sea region, just like Crimean Tatars, with Crimean Tatars, Turkey works with Gagauzians through cultural ties, historical ties, and they also involve economic mechanisms where it's possible. The causes of such intense cooperation is the potential conflict with Russian Federation, even in economic plane. But again, let's look at the events in Syria. Turkey, in the format of choice, it's either or. They would rather support Moldovan Church rather than Romanian Orthodox Church. They want to dominate in the Black Sea region, and having Moldova uniting with Romania will result in establishment of another big competitor in the region. So in this case, Turkey would rather work with Moldovan Church, and they directly object any union between Moldova and Romania. Now let's switch to Russia. Russian policy. Russia is a key player, but their policy is quite simple. The creation of a point of chaos, point of destabilization in the region, and thus blocking or restricting the freedom of political choice for many countries. Because even the Transnistria conflict itself, it was a classic of collapse of Soviet Union when Russia was provoking conflicts in different countries of former Soviet Union. It's destabilization of Ukraine, Karabakh, Central Asia, and in this format, for Russia, it's critically important to have the conflict either frozen or to create the political tension, because it restricts Romania, it restricts Moldova, it creates destabilization in the south of Odessa region, and it prevents implementation of a lot of projects in the region, including logistical infrastructure and military projects. And Russia doesn't really need Transnistria. Let me remind you, there was a referendum in Transnistrian Moldovan Republic, and they said, we want to be a part of Russia. And Russia only needs Transnistria in one format, if they capture the south of Ukraine. But in the current format, Russia doesn't need it. They only need a point of influence to influence Moldova in general. When it comes to trade, Moscow is one of the key foreign trade partners of Moldova, or it used to be. Maybe it will become one again. But even looking at the export structure, Russia was working with Transnistrian industry, metallurgical works in Transnistria. All of the investments were channeled there, so all of those funds were aimed at supporting the separatism there. When it comes to gas, yeah, Transnistria was generating electricity. Transnistria was not paying for the gas from which that electricity was generated, but they were making money on selling that electricity. Now it's a game to intimidate Gagauzans. Like, again, if there will be European integration or union with Romania, Gagauzans cease to exist. It's a trigger matter for these people. Then passport diplomacy, passportization of the Moldovan citizens with Russian passports. Well, again, talking about disruption of the region, a couple of words about current gas crisis. Russia doesn't need Transnistria, and they need to have a gas crisis there in Moldova or Transnistria, because part of the citizens of Transnistria, they have Moldovan passports, but during referendum, due to a small number of voting sites, they were bringing people to other voting sites, and in case of absence of heat supply, they will all go to Europe and they will dwell near the voting sites. People will vote there shortly. But again, the victory of Maya Sandu in the presidential elections was only achieved thanks to the diaspora. The advantage was only like 10,000 votes or something. So, and in that case, another 100,000 voters are going to create another advantage. Here's the chart of balance of interest. First column is development of economic cooperation without influence over the economy. So-called transparent white investments is not interesting for the United States, because Moldova is a small economy and it's beyond their sphere of attention. Another country is not interested for is Russia. Another column is domination and imposition of restrictions on political maneuvers through economy. It's not interesting for the United States because they act through Romania. Germany acts as a country who acts more from the European position, which is the position not aimed at intensification of regional players. Moldova continues to be an important tool for many players, and the trade with Moldova has so-called double bottom. You have to enter and continue influencing the economy of Moldova. Then goes Moldova as a buffer and a zone of influence, the buffer state that doesn't become a part of European Union and NATO and serves just as a battlefield between Russia and European Union. For Russia, it's important to retain Moldova as a buffer, not as a battle zone. For EU, USA, they perceive Moldova as a potential buffer, but it's not desirable, but it's quite a normal thing for France and Germany. Another issue is influence over the internal policy. The United States and Germany and China, they don't have such opportunities for others. It's important. Ukrainian Euro integration, it's logical that European countries are either neutral or against union with Romania, almost for everybody, say for Romania. China doesn't care, and USA can admit it. Moldova as a part of the regional security structure, if such an architecture will be built apart from NATO or as a part of European security architecture, again, the key players are Romania, Poland, and even France are the countries who will favor it. For others, it's either neutral or undesirable option. And Moldova joining NATO, Germany most likely no. For the United States, they don't need it either. For Russia, it's a huge no-no. So this is what we have. And again, it's categorical no for China, and restriction of Russian influence over the processes in Moldova as a buffer. For the United States of America is most likely no, because it's intensification and it contradicts the idea of localization of conflict in Transnistria, because the finalization of Transnistria conflict for the United States is an undesirable option, but for the rest it's quite an acceptable option. And talking about Ukrainian interests, this chart, why have we been preparing this study without some profound discussion about what's going on in Moldova itself? Because Ukraine is one of the key players, but we don't have a consistent policy with regard to Moldova. We talk about their territorial integrity, we talk about their Euro integration, but we don't have a policy with regard to Gagauzia. We don't have any idea about the policy of union between Moldova and Romania. We don't have a policy with regard to transit, because a lot of new projects are emerging. What Turkey is trying to build, for example, the railway between Iraq and Turkey. So it all ends in the Danube. So we don't have a consistent policy, unfortunately, so far in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Igar and Mr. Vadym. Let's try to finalize everything that we've just heard about the influences, and let's try to see where are we in this process and how it would influence us. Well, basically, when I'm asked this question, where we are, it reminds me of the story with Pavlo Lazarenko, when he was asking this question from his visitor, like, everything sounds good, but where am I in this scheme? So talking about the upcoming elections in Moldova, summer 2025, now basically the most intense phase of the elections campaign is starting, we have to understand a number of important things. First of all, Moldova is a country unique for Europe in a sense that it's small, with a population of less than 4 million, but it has 4 identities: Gagauzan, Romanian, Moldovan, and Soviet. There is no Russian identity, there is a Soviet identity there. And what should we understand for ourselves? There's a number of important things to remember. First of all, let's start with Gagauzia. Igor has said a lot about it, but I would like to draw our attention yet to another aspect, which is hardly noticed by everyone. Within the last 20-25 years, basically within one generation, Gagauzians have lost their national language during the growth of this population. So basically, unlike elder generations, the younger generations of Gagauzians, they don't speak Gagauzian, and when they attempt to build bridges with Turkey, when they attempt to do some pro-Turkish things, until this moment, it looks more as a game of elites, which is more related to making money rather than having Turkic or Turkish ideas penetrating the Gagauzia itself. So let's not forget that in the beginning of the 90s, traditional appeal of Gagauzians, they were not calling themselves Gagauzians, they were calling themselves Orthodox. They were telling each other like, hey, Orthodox, let's do something. That was one of the key identities. And when we try to extrapolate the potential influence of Turkey or Russia over Moldova, we have to remember that Russian influence is still dominating despite everything, and playing with Turkish is the game of Gagauzian elites rather than general population. And when it comes to Soviet identity, we have to remember Ukraine, because major part of representatives of that Soviet identity are the people who are either really or nominally Ukrainians by their last name. So de facto, currently, we don't have, Ukraine doesn't have any real work with that quite a big diaspora that currently exists in Moldova. And classical example is the work of Ukrainian center near the embassy, which is not populated with sense for the time being, not populated with content. And de facto, we may state that yes, the Soviet identity is dying out, but unfortunately it's dying very slowly, and unfortunately it's not gonna die within the next year or two. And what I wanted to add, Transnistria, yeah, this is something that I wanted to say. Igor likes to talk a lot. You can see if he's not stopped, we're staying here forever. So basically in Transnistria, half of the population speaks Ukrainian. That's real. Half of the population speaks Ukrainian, and there's no single Telegram channel, no influence created by Ukraine that would exercise some normal communications in Moldova. And now let's proceed to Moldovan identity. Why has Maya Sandu won there during the parliamentary election, not the presidential ones? Because for the first time since the day of establishment of independent Moldova, they were able to unite people with Moldovan and Romanian identity. It was unexpected for Russians in the first place, when the people with identities who seemed to be impossible to unite, they could not vote for one political force, but they stood united, voting in the same political forces. The Russians were trying to divide people with Moldovan and Romanian identity, and it's a key political technology project of the Russians. They have supporting projects in Gagauzia for the people with Soviet identity, and it was a key project of the division or segregation of people with Moldovan identity from the ones with Romanian identity. And the key question this summer is how successful will Russians be in dividing those people, and how successful will Maya Sandu be in uniting people with those identities. And it will be the answer to the question about the future of Moldova. Even if Maya Sandu, with an advantage of 10,000 votes or a couple thousand votes, wins in the parliamentary elections, it can create irreversible processes for the people with processes of unification of people with Romanian and Moldovan identity. And shouldn't it happen, the processes of destabilization will continue, and we will have quite a difficult partner in the border of Ukraine, with whom it will be difficult for us to cooperate, and that's it on my end. Well, dear guests, if you have any questions on the floor, please raise your hands. Well, and let me still add a couple of things about Ukraine. Well, when it comes to the Transnistrian statistics, more than 100,000 denizens of Transnistria, they have Ukrainian passports, which means that those people may vote in the presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine. We have a demographic crisis. Now, a lot of Ukrainians are currently staying abroad, all right? We will have elections after the war is suspended, and 100,000 people is quite an intense resource. And, you know, to organize their delivery to Odessa region using buses is not a huge problem. What's most interesting, you know, maybe it's a classified information about the number of passportized Ukrainian citizens, but the official government of Transnistria is stating that more than 100,000 denizens of Transnistria have Ukrainian passports, and they will vote in Ukrainian elections having their Soviet identity. Well, Vadym, the last question, how about the gas crisis? How will they play this card during the parliamentary elections? Well, first of all, I want to calm everybody down. 100,000 Transnistrians are not coming to Ukraine in no way, but let's remember about it when the list of voters will be compiled during the elections. Well, the gas crisis will be played on, but gas will not be a key issue. It will be one of the elements, but the main story will be how to create this division between the people with Moldovan and Romanian identities, and there will be a lot of intimidations, but the gas will play its part, but not more than that. Thank you very much for this interesting conversation, and thank you, friends, for your interest in this topic, and we continue working together for our victory. We would like to thank the Security and Defense Forces, thanks to whom we can hold events like this. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.